What's up, everybody? FTWitachi here. You know what it is. Thank you all very much for tuning in to the Conduit Guide for Demonology, Destruction, and Affliction Warlocks. I do want to go ahead and start off by saying I do apologize for this video and the next one taking forever to get released. I've been absolutely extremely busy IRL. This one being the conduits and the next one being the legendaries. This is an updated guide for patch 9.0.5 and stay tuned for patch 9.1 because we're going to be going ham with releasing these guides to you as quickly as possible as I've been doing a lot of work behind the scenes. So, without further ado, let's get into the guide for conduits. Each Shadowlands Covenant unlocks 3 soulbinds, each of which offered a talent tree type selection of improvements. If you have not seen our Covenant guide for Warlocks, I strongly suggest you go ahead and do so on that, which you'll be able to find in our World of Warcraft Shadowlands playlist. Again, that is the Covenants guide, and then of course we also have a Soulbinds guide for all 3 specs as well. So go ahead and check out our Soulbinds guide. Again, the Covenants and the Soulbinds are tied in together along with the conduits. Some of these nodes on these trees can be filled with conduits, so kind of like a gem socket into a talent tree, or similar to how we had back in Legion artifact weapons, how you were able to put artifact power into those weapons. Very similar to how that was working with conduits into soulbinds. Again, covenants are the sanctum or the location or the allegiance that you're going to be going into with Shadowlands. So there's 4 covenant systems, and then of course soulbinds. There's 3 different soulbinds, which are NPCs or characters that you bond yourself with or bind yourself with, and then with those soulbinds they each have a talent tree. So again, 4 covenants, 3 soulbinds, making that 12 total soulbinds, and then each soulbind has a talent tree, which you get to enhance a specific part of your class's toolkit with these conduits. So, in this video, I'm going to be detailing for Demonology, Affliction, and Destruction Warlocks. Conduits come in 3 different forms. Potency Conduits enhance your class's throughput potential, which is your damage, which is the main conduit of choice that you want to go with. Endurance Conduits focus on your defensive toolkit and healing by providing things like cooldown reduction and amplification to sustain defensive cooldowns as well as increasing healing, as well as Finesse Conduits, which enhance niche parts of the spec's toolkit. So, without further ado, let's go over each and every single conduit before we go into deep details on each one for Demonology, Destruction, and Affliction. So starting off with the Endurance Conduits for Warlocks. There's 3 in total, and we're going to be going over the item level 145 versions of each and every single conduit. What that means is these are the lowest versions of each conduit because you can increase the item level by getting a better version of these conduits. Starting off with the first one, Accrued Vitality. Drain life heals for 44% of the amount drained over 10 seconds. Next up, Diabolic Bloodstone. Anyone that consumes your health stones infuses you with 10% leech for 6 seconds. And of course, Resolute Barrier. Attacks received that deal at least 5% of your health decrease the unending resolves cooldown by 10 seconds. Cannot occur more than once every 30 seconds. Next up, we've got 4 different Finesse Conduits that all Warlocks can use. Starting off with Demonic Momentum. Demonic Circle. Teleports increases movement speed by 30% for 5 seconds. Fel Celerity. The cooldown of Fel Domination is reduced by 48 seconds. Shade of Terror. Your fear effects can withstand 100% more damage before breaking. Kilrog's Cunning. Your Eye of Kilrog is no longer stealth and can now place your Demonic Circle. You must be within line of sight of your Eye of Kilrog to place that Demonic Circle. The movement speed of your Eye of Kilrog is also increased by 50%. Starting off with the Covenant specified conduits when it comes to potency, we've got Soul Tith. When a target dies under the effects of Scurrying Tith, gain 10% to increase damage to your Afflictions, Malefic Rapture, Demonology's Demons, as well as Destruction's Chaos Bolts. This is through the Covenant of the Kyrian. Next up, Catastrophic Origin. Impending catastrophes damage over time, and the inflicted curse lasts 50% longer against your primary target. This is through the Venthyr. Next up, we got Fatal Decimation. Decimating bolts missiles deal 50% increased damage. This is through the Necrolord. And of course, Soul Eater. Soul Rot's damage and radius is increased by 25%. This is through the Night Fae. Now going into the Demonology specific conduits. And again, these are Potency Conduits. There's 4 for each spec, and we're going to be starting off with Born of Blood. Hand of Gul'dan has a 16% chance to generate a charge of Demonic Core. Carnivorous Stalkers. Your Dreadstalkers attacks have a 3% chance to trigger an additional Dreadbite. Fel Commando. Your Felguard deals 7.5% more damage and takes 7.5% less damage. And of course, Tyrant Soul. After your Demonic Tyrant expires, gain a stack of Demonic Core and increase the damage of your demons deal by 10% for 15 seconds. Next up, the Destruction specific conduits. Again, a total of 4. Ashen Remains. Chaos Bolt and Incinerate deal 4% increased damage to targets afflicted by Immolate. Combusting Engine. Conflagrate increases your remaining Immolate damage by 8% until the Immolate expires or is refreshed. Duplicatious Havoc. Havoc transfers 10% more damage. Infernal Brand. Your Infernal's melee attacks cause its target to take 2% increased damage from its immolation, stacking up to 15 times. And of course, last but not least, the 4 Potency Conduits for Affliction Warlocks. Cold Embrace. The effectiveness of Shadow Embrace is increased by 33%. Corrupting Leer. Agony and Unstable Affliction damage have a 3% chance to reduce the cooldown of Summoned Dark Glare by 5 seconds. Focused Malignancy. Malefic Rapture deals 15% increased damage to targets suffering from Unstable Affliction. And of course, last but not least, Rolling Agony. The duration of Agony is increased by 4 seconds. Alright, so let's go ahead and get into which conduits are the best for Warlocks. We're going to start off with Endurance Conduits because, again, Demonology, Destruction, and Affliction all can use these conduits, and there's not really much of a ranking as of choice when it comes to these 3. It just kind of comes down to personal preference because none of these are really going to affect your gameplay all too much. Accrued Vitality, it's largely only useful for solo content, and it's just kind of bad compared to the other 2. Diabolic Bloodstone is the most useful endurance conduit due to health stones being used often in both situations, and having additional healing available to you through Leech is never bad. Comparing it to Resolute Barrier, Diabolic Bloodstone is the best, especially when you're comparing solo content and group play. So if you are in a raiding situation, if you are in a PvP battleground situation, or even arenas, if you're in a group and you have other people around you that are going to be using those health stones, Diabolic Bloodstone is probably your best bet when it comes to your endurance conduits. However, if you're doing solo content mostly, I strongly suggest going Resolute Barrier. Reducing our major source of damage reduction is good, but it being locked behind that 30-second cooldown, it just kind of loses most of its appeal, and typically the cooldown is not reduced quickly enough for this conduit to really be any helpful. But again, when it comes to solo content, I would rather Resolute Barrier over Accrued Vitality. But again, either or is good. And then of course, if you're in any type of group content, group-based content, I strongly suggest going Diabolic Bloodstone because it is easily the best endurance conduit for all Warlocks. Next up, we're going to be getting into the best finesse conduits for Warlocks. And this is technically almost as bad as the endurance conduits. Starting off with Demonic Momentum. It's not a strong choice, since in most cases using Demonic Circle Teleport will be enough movement anyways. And comparing it to the best finesse conduit, which I'll be going over next, it's not even close. Fel Celerity is easily the most useful finesse conduit available to us, since summoning your pet after a wipe or death while Fel Domination is painful. So I strongly suggest Fel Celerity as your most useful finesse conduit. Shade of Terror is mostly useless for all content outside of soloing and PvP related content, and even then Fel Celerity, especially as a Demonology Warlock when you need your pet out most of the time, Fel Celerity is definitely going to outwin on Shade of Terror. And last but not least, Kilrock's Cunning. You aren't really going to cast this in combat ever, since it leaves your character vulnerable to encounter mechanics. Out of combat, you can simply go to where you want to place your demonic circle anyways, And of course, because you have to be in line of sight with your Kilrog's Cunning to place your Demonic Circle, that makes it even worse. If that wasn't a thing, maybe it could be useful in Battlegrounds where you are on a defensive type of situation, or let's say you are defending a base and you want to just go ahead and quickly maneuver yourself. But then again, Fel Celerity is just going to win anyways, because having that reduction and able to summoning your pet a lot faster, it's just so much more useful. So I strongly suggest Fel Celerity as the best finesse conduit for Warlocks. Next up, we've got the Potency Conduits for the Affliction Warlocks. That entails Cold Embrace, Corrupting Leer, Focused Malignancy, and Rolling Agony, and one of the 4 Covenant-specific Potency Conduits, which is Soul Tith from Kyrian, Fatal Decimation from Necrolord, Soul Eater from Night Fae, and Catastrophic Origin from Venthyr. I'm going to state this right now before we get into the Affliction Warlock Potency Conduits. The Kyrian, Necrolord, Night Fae, and Venthyr Covenant-specific Potency Conduits are kind of useless in most situations when playing an Affliction Warlock, comparing them to the Affliction Core Potency Conduits. The Soul Tith on a raiding situation is pretty much useless on single target, but great potential for AoE fights, kind of like Sun King's Salvation's fight. But other than that, Soul Tith is just really, really poor. But on a Mythic Plus verdict, it's got some great potential to it. But again, I'm comparing this now because it's a Potency Conduit. I have to compare it to the Affliction Core Potency Conduits, and it just doesn't compare to the other 4. If you were a Necrolord with Fatal Decimation, it's a very minimal DPS game on all fronts. When it comes to the Night Phase Soul Eater, it's a very minimal DPS gain on all fronts. And of course, Venthyr's Catastrophic Origin, it's just useless in pretty much any front. Forget the DPS, minimal DPS gain, it's just an absolutely dead conduit choice. So when it comes to Affliction Warlocks and Covenant-specific Potency Conduits, I strongly to not suggest any of them, comparing them to the other 4, which are Cold Embrace, Corrupting Leer, Focused Malignancy, and Rolling Agony. Now, let's go ahead and get into those 4 on which ones are good in specific situations. And again, just to remind you, you're usually only going to have the option to select 2 Potency Conduits at this point in time of the game when it comes to your Soulbinds. Now, in future patches, we might get more opportunity to select different multitudes of conduits, but right now you're usually only going to have 2 Potency Conduit slots in your Soulbind. So that's why we're kind of having to narrow it down to where those Covenant-specific conduits are not really going to be coming into play. Now, starting off with Cold's Embrace, it provides a 33% increase to the effectiveness of Shadow Embrace. This is one of your strongest single target gains, and it is definitely your best single target gain when it comes to your Potency Conduits as your Affliction Warlock, with the second strongest single target gain coming from Focused Malignancy, which again, Malefic Rapture deals 15% increased damage to targets suffering from Unstable Affliction. This doubles down on your focus damage, since the target with Unstable Affliction on it already is taking damage from your Unstable Affliction, and it has the extra dot for Malefic Rapture's damage bonus, in addition to the increased damage from the conduit itself. It pretty much is an always must-take conduit when it comes to Focused Malignancy in all situations, and it is a excellent conduit choice. I much prefer Focused Malignancy over Cold Embrace when it comes to single target damage, but then again, both of them are pretty much neck and neck when it comes to that single target damage. And of course, if you are someone that's doing not just PvP content, not just raiding, not just regular dungeons, but also Mythic Plus content, I strongly suggest Focused Malignancy over Cold Embrace anyways. When it comes to more Cleave and AoE Potency Conduits for Affliction Warlocks, you got the choices of Rolling Agony. Agony's duration increased by 4 seconds, ridiculously strong for multi-target scenarios. The longer your dot duration, the less time you have to reapply your dots, which theoretically means you get to spend more time casting damaging spells. It's not great at single target at all, but it is good for multi-target fights. It's very, very nice to use in Battlegrounds. It's very, very nice to use in Mythic Plus content, where you have multitudes of adds. Then again, it's easily the best cleave and best AoE potency conduit out there. And last but not least, you also have Corrupting Leer, which is the fourth potency conduit for Affliction Warlocks. Agony and Unstable Affliction damage have a 3% chance to reduce the cooldown of Summon Dark Leer by 5 seconds. Unfortunately, Dark Leer is not that strong of a cooldown at the moment, so the viability of this conduit isn't that great, but it's technically, in my opinion, the poorest of the four. But it's not terrible, but it's definitely not the best. If I was to go ahead and say which two that you should be utilizing, again, when it comes to single target potency conduits, strongly suggest using Focused Malignancy and Cold Embrace. That's in regards to, of course, 1v1 duels, raiding situations, so on and so forth, and of course solo content. But again, when it comes to best cleave and AoE potency conduits, I strongly suggest using Rolling Agony as well as Corrupting Leer. Next up, we're going to be getting into the potency conduits for Destruction Warlock, and exactly as stated in Affliction, your Covenant conduits are kind of poor. They are poor. So I'm going to quickly go over them, but again, the 4 core Destruction conduits are definitely better than any of these Covenant conduits. Starting off with Kyrian's Soul Tith, it's an increase to your Chaos Bolt damage by 10% for 10 seconds. If a target dies while affected by Scurrying Tith, basically by that dot, you gain 5 soul shards, meaning you're able to cast at least 2, probably 3 buff bolts. This is decently strong conduit in situations where you'll be able to proc this often, but just to give you a heads up, it's not optimal, because it is a decent DPS game, but it's not optimal comparing them to any of the core conduit choices for Destruction Warlock. Catastrophic Origin from the Venthyr, it's uninteresting. This ability is already underperforming significantly compared to the other alternative Covenant abilities. It's a minor DPS gain, but other than that, it is absolutely dog poo. Necrolord's Fatal Decimation. It's not very strong. Decimating Bolt's strength is in the empowerment of Incinerate rather than its missile damage. This is by no means useless, and still is a decent buff to the ability's damage, especially during execute phases. So it's a very minor DPS gain, but then again, comparing them to the core Destruction Warlock conduits, it is not useful. Night Phase Soul Eater. It's a nice damage increase to this ability. The radius increase means it could hit a target it would have otherwise missed, which is great. But it's very rarely useful and is situationally good in like AoE type of content. But then again, comparing them to the core Destruction Warlock potency conduits, it is not useful. Now getting into it, starting off with Ashen Remains. It's a strong bonus, primarily a flat % increase to your Incinerate and Chaos Bolt, as your target should always be affected by Immolate. It's a solid DPS gain on both single target and cleave, so this would work well in pretty much any given situation, whether that being PvP, raiding, Mythic Plus content, you name it. Next up, we've got Combusting Engine. It's a decent damage boost to your Immolate dot, but this can be hard to play optimally. You want to drop as many Conflagrates into a long duration Immolate to increase its damage for the longest possible time. This is a solid DPS gain on both single target and cleave as well, very similar to Ashen Remains, and it's pretty much overall good for both PvP, PvE content, and so on. Duplicatious Havoc, as long as our damage is dealt during the Havoc window, this is a nice addition. It goes without saying the conduit is only useful or usable on multiple targets. So it's not really great for solo raid boss fights. It is good on like multiple target boss fights, multiple target content such as raided battlegrounds and Mythic Plus content, and pretty much going in from there. So it is very useless on single target, but it has its niche and it has its usage, and of course it's a DPS gain on multi-target fights. And last but not least, Infernal Brand. This conduit values are increased significantly when paired with Reign of Chaos, which if you've seen my destruction guide, I strongly like. As you will stack it up to 15 stacks faster, this also means tuning the conduit is hard. It doesn't perform well enough to really be considered though, so again, I suggest it if you are going with the Reign of Chaos method, but overall, Infernal Brand isn't one of the better potency conduits. It is a minor DPS gain on pretty much all fronts. Now to quickly recap, on most soulbinds, you're only going to be able to have 2 potency conduits. So again, When it comes to single target content, I strongly suggest going with your two strongest potency conduits for Destruction Warlock, being Combusting Engine or Ashen Remains. There is a third conduit that I would suggest as well if for some reason your Fatal Decimation Necrolord only conduit is at a really high item level compared to Ashen Remains or Combusting Engine. You can go ahead and throw in Fatal Decimation as well. And of course, when it comes to best cleave and AoE potency conduits for Destruction Warlock, you're definitely going to want to go with Infernal Brand and Duplicatious Havoc. Again, this is for cleave and AoE potential fights. For example, Mythic Plus content, rated battlegrounds where there's multitudes of targets in one little area. And that's pretty much it. Again, on multiple target fights, you're going to want to go with Duplicatious Havoc and Infernal Brand. Last but not least, the Demonology specific conduits. Again, sadly, the Covenant specific conduits are just not as good as the core conduits for Demonology Warlock, very similar to Destruction and Affliction. However, we're going to go over them anyways. Soul Tith, having the option ability to further stack damage onto your demons is a very appealing trait, especially if you can line up Scurrying Tith with Summon Demonic Tyrant. This is a moderate DPS gain on all fronts, so it's not terrible, but it's not as good as any of the core conduits. Catastrophic Origin, making your curses last longer is not really useful, and the increases the damage over time component of impending catastrophe. It's a minor DPS game, and it is the worst conduit of all times, in the worst covenant of all times. Next up, Fatal Decimation. It's a simple damage amplifier to Decimating Bolt that could enable the ability to be a reliable source of target swapping at later ranks. It's a moderate DPS gain, but again, comparing them to any of the core Demonology specific potency conduits, it is not really useful. And last but not least, Soul Eater. Increasing the radius of Soul Rot is not that big of a deal, but it's kind of nice because it would get that extra mob that it wouldn't have gotten before. And damage increase is weak compared to any other conduit, which is why it's a moderate DPS gain on all fronts, and it's just really not that useful. So, going into the Demonology specific conduits, you've got Born of Blood. While there are some talent builds that revolve around Demon Bolt and gaining access to more demonic core is nice, this conduit is weak compared to others. However, it is probably your most useful potency conduit. It's a major DPS gain in both raiding, Mythic Plus content, PvP and duels, arenas, rated battlegrounds. Overall, it is one of your better, even though I said it's weak compared to others when it comes to damage-wise, utility-wise, it's going to be an absolute banger. Carnivorous Stalkers pairs nicely if you're doing the Dreadstalker build that I've gone over in my Demonology Warlock guide, which includes Dreadlash and From the Shadows, in AoE situations, and as a build enabler for Mythic Plus, making this a decent build overall. So Carnivorous Stalkers, if you are playing the Dreadstalker build, it is a very major DPS gain. Fel Commando is a strong conduit overall, since Felguard tends to be a solid source of our damage output, and it's the most well-rounded option in pretty much any given situation, and it is a minor DPS gain. And Tyrant Soul, having further access to increase demon damage even after Summon Demonic Tyrant expires, is a strong overall, and also provides a predictable source of another stack of demonic core as well. It's a good DPS gain in raiding, Mythic Plus content, rated battlegrounds, arenas, so on and so forth. So overall, you don't really see too many multi-target or single target specific only conduits. Most of them are just built into the Demonology Warlock platform. So again, when it comes to Carnivorous Stalkers, it's only useful if you're playing the Dreadstalker build. So I'm going to go ahead and push that one to the side and just focus on Born of Blood, Fel Commando, and Tyrant's Soul. When it comes for single target potency conduits, you're definitely going to want to go with Born of Blood, as that is our best potency conduit overall. When it comes to Born of Blood, Hand of Gul'dan has a 15% chance to generate a charge of demonic core, which is just very, very useful. As a conduit itself, damage-wise, it's extremely poor, but it has an ability that increases our damage in a different set of form, with demonic core going into demon bolts, and being able to summon more demons is always a blessing. At number 2, I love Tyrant's Soul. After your Demonic Tyrant expires, you gain a stack of Demonic Core and increases the damage of your demons by 10% for 15 seconds. It is slightly better, in my opinion, than Fel Commando. Your Fel Guard deals 10% more damage and takes 10% less damage. And again, of course, at number 4, I'm going to have Carnivorous Stalkers. It is the best conduit if you are playing the Dread Stalker build, but again, I pushed that one to the side. So again, recapping, single target Potency Conduits, Born of Blood at number 1, Tyrant's Soul number 2, and Fel Commando at number 3. When it comes to AoE or cleave fights, I would strongly suggest going with Born of Blood, and then of course Fel Commando. But if you are again using the Dread Stalker build, Born of Blood and Carnivorous Stalkers is your go-to. So with all of that being said, thank you all very much for tuning in to our Conduit Warlock guide for patch 9.0.5. Stay tuned, got one more guide to get out to you guys as quickly as I possibly can. The Legendary guide going over legendaries for Demonology, Destruction, and Affliction Warlocks. Please like this video if it helped you, share it of course, comment down below if you have any questions, and of course, I'll catch you all next time. Peace out everybody.